Welcome to another episode of Horrible History. I'm here at the Mountain Meadows Massacre site, where about 120 immigrants who were traveling from Arkansas to California had their lives taken too shortly here in Mountain Meadows, Utah, by Mormons and the Paiute people.
Now, there was a lot going on with the Mormons and the federal government that led up to this whole fiasco out in Utah. Before the Mormons moved out west, there was a lot of tension between them and the rest of the United States out in the east. There was a lot of people who thought that their religion was subversive to the federal government and their control. There were many incidents that led up to Mormon expansion out to the west. In 1838, an angry mob would take the lives of 18 Mormon men and boys at the massacre of Hans Mill. In 1844, Joseph Smith Jr. and Hiram Smith would be imprisoned in Carthage, Illinois. They would be awaiting trial and ensured safety in the prison until their trial date. But an angry mob would take their lives prematurely before they could stand trial. There was just a lot of anger and resentment aimed at the Mormon people. After years of persecution and attacks, Brigham Young would guide the Mormon people out to Salt Lake City, Utah, where they would find their forever home and just want to be left alone out in the West. It's kind of ironic how America was based on religious freedom, and now you had these new people who were being persecuted for their belief system. Now fast forward a little bit to 1857, and you have the Baker-Fancher group, who were a group of settlers from Missouri and Arkansas who were just trying to get out to California, whether it be to drive some cattle out there to make a little money, or maybe they had that gold in their eyes because the gold rush. And some just wanted to relocate their family because there was a land of opportunity and new frontier. It was adventure and opportunity for a lot of people, and that's what drove many people from the East Coast out to the West Coast. This is much like the Donner Party in 1846. But learning from that, the Baker-Fancher Party probably wasn't going to take that northern route through the mountains. This same year, President Buchanan wanted to regain control of the Utah Territory. This would begin the Utah Expedition, where he would send military out to Utah to regain control of the Mormons. The Mormons didn't want to be regulated by the federal government, so they were getting ready for war with the United States. This is when Brigham Young would declare martial law over the whole state. He would warn the people of Utah that the American government was trying to come out there and take their way of life. So he told everybody in Utah, hey, don't trade with any settlers or people who come over here. We need to stockpile our supplies and make sure that we have enough to fight this war with the United States government. This was just a recipe for disaster for the Baker-Fancher group. The Baker-Fancher group would be guided by Captain John Twitty Baker and Captain Alexander Fancher. The group consisted of about 200 settlers, including men, women, children, military, and about 1,000 head of oxen. So this is a pretty big group of settlers trying to get out west. A lot of them like to travel in big groups for protection from Native American attacks or the weather and elements or even the wilderness. There was strength in numbers, so they would travel in these pretty big groups of settlers. Over the course of travel, the group size would change because some families and groups would like to head off and settle in different areas, or maybe their destination was different than the rest of the group. So the Baker-Fancher group leaves Missouri in about April of 1857. They make it through the whole middle of America, and they get to Salt Lake City around August 3rd or 4th. The people in Salt Lake City were not very fond of them. They said, don't trust any of these outsiders because the American government is coming out here trying to take our way of life and our freedom and our lives. So the Baker-Fancher group are like, okay, then I guess we'll just leave and we'll be on our way. But they know they need to resupply because they've been using them on this long journey. They don't want to take the northern route through the mountains, so they decide to take the southern route because Captain Fancher was a little more familiar with it from his trip in 1850. So the Baker-Fancher group start heading south through Utah. They stop in Cedar City. Here, tensions get a little bit higher. There's been some rumors that some of the people in the Baker-Fancher group were involved in the Hans Mill Massacre. So the Baker-Fancher group is sent out of Cedar City without getting any supplies. They're going to try to just rough it through the rest of Utah, Arizona, Nevada, and try to get to California. The last stop before they head on this long stretch is the Mountain Meadows. Now this was a beautiful meadow for the people to rest, to give their cattle some feed and water, and get ready for this long journey through the desert. Now Isaac Haight was a Mormon leader in that southern region of Utah. He did not like that these immigrants were trying to pass through his state. Now they all knew that the United States military was coming, and they thought that if they arrived when that group of immigrants was there, the immigrants would definitely join the United States Army to fight them. Isaac Haight would drum up animosity for this group of seemingly peaceful settlers. Isaac Haight would have meetings with local militia leaders such as Colonel Dame and John D. Lee. He would have them come and try to decide on what they should do about these immigrants. Unsure of what to do, Haight would send a rider up to Brigham Young asking what to do with the immigrant group. Their idea was to have the Paiute people attack this group of immigrants. This would shift blame from Mormons onto the Paiute people and also take care of the immigrant problem. Not everyone was a big fan of this plan, but to serve the church, John D. Lee would go and ask the Paiute people to do this. He would tell the Paiute people to go make camp near where the immigrants were resting in Mountain Meadows. He was going to go and gather up other Native American tribes to help in the attack, because this was a pretty big group of immigrants. The Paiute people wanted John D. Lee to lead the attack, and he was going to, but he had to go gather some more Native American groups. The Paiute people didn't wait. They went ahead with the attack. Their numbers were limited, they didn't take them all, they took some of their lives and injured many others. But now, the immigrants were on high alert. Also in this attack, the Paiute people lost some of their strong warriors. As soon as John D. Lee heard this, he dropped what he was doing and he got there and he said, "What are you guys doing? Why did you attack? I told you to wait." And they said, "Hey, you were supposed to lead the attack. We want you to lead the attack. If you don't, we're going to declare war on the Mormons after we take care of these people." So John D. Lee, with his hands tied, didn't want to cause a bigger war and damage to the church. He went ahead and said, "Okay, I'll help you." So they gathered some local militia to join in the attack with the Paiute people. The initial attack on the immigrant group was on September 7th, 1857. After being attacked, they would lower their wagons, chain them together, and put dirt in the wagons to act as cover. Sitting here, running out of food and water and having some wounded people and having to practice probably unsanitary medicine probably led them to have to make some rash decisions. A few men from the Baker-Fancher group were able to escape the siege and try to head to Cedar City looking for help. On the way to Cedar City, one of the riders would be shot in the back. The other men saw that it was a white man. It wasn't a Paiute Native American. This was a death sentence for the Mormon people if word got out. After the Baker-Fancher group learned that the Mormons had something to do with these attacks, Haight and Dame came to the conclusion that all of the people in the immigrant party who could speak couldn't leave here alive. It is the orders of the president that all the immigrants must be put out of the way. President Haight has counseled with Colonel Dame, or has had orders from him to put all of the immigrants out of the way. None who are old enough to talk are to be spared. Basically, the Mormons were afraid that if these people made it out of Mountain Meadows and got to California, they would tell the local authorities that it was the Mormons who attacked. This would cause an attack from the federal government against the Mormons, practically wiping all of them out. John D. Lee was deeply troubled by these orders. They even said that he cried over this, and that the Native Americans made fun of him and gave him the nickname Yawguts, which means crybaby. It seems that he was put in a position that he didn't want to follow orders, but he still wanted to serve his religion and his church. I mean, he writes that in his diary. I don't know how much credibility there is to the word of somebody who did something this heinous and evil. So a new plan was created, and this time, John D. Lee would go out and meet the immigrant group under a white flag of truce. He told them to lay down their arms and they would escort them to Cedar City for protection from the Paiute people. What choice did the immigrant group really have? They didn't have water, they didn't have food, and they had injured people. Plus, the women and children are there that they have to protect. The Baker-Fancher group were definitely in a tough situation, and they decided to go along with the plan. Gave up their arms, and at a certain point in their walk, Captain Higbee gave the order, "Halt, do your duty." In a matter of minutes, approximately 120 people lost their lives in Mountain Meadows. Once the deed was done, the rider would return with word from Brigham Young saying to let the immigrants go. I'm not sure how much validity there is to that message, but this is what the church has spoken. After the incident, there is a silence while the men stand in the meadows looking at what they had done. Soon after, they retreat to a nearby camp and get their stories straight and swear an oath of secrecy. Because of this whole incident, the church decides to run an internal investigation, and what do you know, they find that something happened here, but they don't know who, or no witnesses will give any statements about who was involved or what happened or who called these orders. The young children are taken into the community and placed in different homes to be cared for. Eventually, these children would be returned back to Arkansas to the closest of kin. So things go quiet for a little bit. President Buchanan is out. Abraham Lincoln is elected in 1861, and he has bigger issues on his hands, like the Civil War. So he doesn't have time to run federal investigations on what happened out in Utah. Haight and Dame and Lee would all be excommunicated from the church. Just excommunication, no real indictments or charges. The Mormon church did not want to be blamed for this evil act that took place in Mountain Meadows. They were doing everything they could to shift blame onto individual actors or make the whole matter go away altogether. It wouldn't be until a man named Klingensmith, who would break his oath of secrecy and finally start telling what happened in Mountain Meadows. Lee and Dame would be the first two arrested in 1875 for their involvement in the Mountain Meadows Massacre. The first trial would take place with a lot of blame still being placed on the church and Lee. There were a lot of Mormons on the jury, so this trial would end in no verdict. In the second trial, though, it would just be John D. Lee, who would become the scapegoat for the Mountain Meadows Massacre. The church would cut a deal and say, hey, we'll give you Lee for the Mountain Meadows Massacre, but drop all charges and suspicion of the church. We want this whole thing to just go away. John D. Lee would be sentenced to death, and the judge gave him a choice. He said you could be hanged, firing squad, or beheaded. John D. Lee would choose the firing squad. In 1877, John D. Lee would be taken back to the site of the massacre, and there a firing squad would take his life in the same spot where he took the lives of those innocent people. There were a lot more people who were involved who still needed to face justice, but they would escape it due to protection from the Mormon Church. Now I had the chance to go out there and see where these atrocities took place, and I'd love to show you some of the things that I saw in some of the memorials that are there to this day. The natural beauty of the southern Utah desert creates a sense of tranquility and peace, only for the blood-stained mountains to act as a reminder of the atrocities that have taken place in this area. Once you get to a small stretch of Highway 18, tributes to the Mountain Meadows Massacre stand in remembrance to the victims of these heinous acts. The first one on my list was the Overlook Memorial.
I'm in Mountain Meadows, Utah, at the site of the actual massacre that occurred here between the Mormons and the immigrants from Arkansas. This is a memorial that was put up in 1990 by some of the families of those that perished here on this site. If you look over there, you'll see the exact site where they were camped out. These are memorials that have been put all throughout here just to memorialize those people and not forget the tragedy that happened right here. It's crazy to think that there was men, women, and children all camped out here throughout the valley by the Great Basin, where they were all just trying to restock their cattle and get ready to go to California. The tragedy that befell them is a huge betrayal by our fellow man on one another. To take men and women and children who had laid down their arms and trusted you and take their lives out here in cold blood. It truly is a tragedy and a huge stain on American and Mormon history.
A short distance from the Overlook Memorial is a large stone pile next to the exact campsite of the Baker-Fancher group. This site is known as the Gravesite Memorial.
I'm at the beautiful National Historic Landmark of the Mountain Meadows Massacre. It's truly tragic, and I guess the whole gravity of the situation really hits you when you go in and you see the name placards and you see the age of the men, women, and children, some down to 8 years old, had lost their life here in this site. And this is the least we can do to try to remember them. Even the Arkansas flag is being flown here because that's where these immigrants had come from. They built this as a proper memorial to the people who lost their lives right here where they were camping. Could you imagine coming out here, trying to live your American dream and make it to California, and then to be taken under the guise of a truce, only to be betrayed and have your women and children and men murdered?
Next to the stone pile, there is a circular walking path around the perimeter of the meadow. This path leads you to a couple more memorial sites along the way.
It's a very heavy feeling right here, knowing that this is probably the place where those 120 people circled their wagons right here in this field, just not knowing the fate of them and their family and friends. It's just a tragedy that what happened here on this spot, and it's unknown how many grave sites this is or how many bodies were buried here. But I'm glad that we are memorializing it. And after seeing the age of some of those children out there, it's truly heartbreaking what happened here. After about 20 years of the tragic events that happened right here, John D. Lee was brought back to this site after he was convicted of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death, and he was able to choose. He could either be beheaded, hung, or firing squad. He chose firing squad right here on this spot. The other higher-ups in the Mormon church were totally let go and off the hook. Nobody else was implicated in these murders except John D. Lee.
The gravesite memorial left me feeling unsettled and shaken by the enormity of the events that took place there. It was time to move on to the last two memorials. Further down Highway 18, there are two separate memorials, one to the boys and men lost in the massacre, and another to the women and children who lost their lives to evil.
So this is another memorial site that is dedicated to the men and boys that were prematurely killed over at the Mountain Meadows Massacre. It lies here right off the highway. It's a little hard to get to, but it's nice that they put a little memorial out here dedicated to those men and boys that lost their lives. This is the last memorial out here in Mountain Meadows. This one is dedicated to the women, children, and wounded people whose lives were taken out here in cold blood. There was no reason to kill these people. They were just women and children. They should be your most protected. But here, their lives were taken unjustly. And this is just to commemorate them and not forget who they were. Some of the memorial sites are a little spread out and hard to get to because you have to pull right off of the highway to see the memorials, and they're kind of small. But I'm glad that the families and relatives of the victims of the Mountain Meadows Massacre put a memorial and remembrance to these people who innocently lost their lives out there. I think many of the people who were involved in the Mountain Meadows Massacre were caught up in false information and religious zealotry of Isaac Haight. He ordered this attack on a peaceful group of settlers. What they thought was a solution was pure savagery. This event in history acts as a cautionary tale for people who blindly follow orders and adhere to religious zealotry. I would never want to condemn the entire Mormon religion for the actions of a few evil people. I want to tell the stories of the people who can't tell them,
so that we don't forget what happened in our past so that we don't repeat it. This large group of people lost their lives in Mountain Meadows for no reason. And that's what makes this event a part of horrible history. Thank you all for watching this episode of Horrible History about the Mountain Meadows Massacre. If you liked the video, hit like and subscribe. If you didn't, thank you so much for watching this long. Please leave a comment below telling me what you thought about the video or if there's any stories that you want me to cover. I read all of your comments and I love to hear from all of you. Bye.